It was a sunny afternoon in the heart of a bustling city. People hurried down the sidewalk, lost in their routines, juggling coffee cups, bags, and phones, as life carried on without pause. Among the crowd sat James, a kind-hearted black man in a wheelchair, positioned at the edge of a small park. He had a warm smile, a thoughtful demeanor, and a calming presence that often went unnoticed by those rushing past. James had seen his fair share of life's struggles, but he never let it dim his spirit. On this particular day, he was quietly enjoying the fresh air, watching birds flutter between the trees and greeting passers-by with a gentle nod. He wasn't looking for any trouble, just a bit of peace. But trouble has a way of finding people who least deserve it. Out of the corner of his eye, James noticed a middle-aged white woman storming toward him, her face twisted in frustration. She was dressed impeccably, carrying a designer handbag that she swung with every step, clearly agitated about something. James assumed she was just another passerby until she stopped right in front of him. "Do you even belong here?" she snapped, her voice sharp and loud enough to draw attention. A few people slowed their pace, glancing toward the scene but quickly moving on, not wanting to get involved. James blinked, caught off guard by her hostility. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with confusion. Quote, "You heard me," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "People like you. You just sit here all day, taking up space. Don't you have anything better to do?" She looked him up and down, her eyes filled with disdain. James could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him, but he kept his composure. He had learned long ago that meeting anger with anger never solved anything. "Ma'am, I'm just enjoying the day like everyone else," he replied, his voice steady. But his politeness only seemed to fuel her rage. "Enjoying the day? People like me have to work hard for everything we have, and here you are, just sitting there, doing nothing. And don't even get me started on how people like you milk the system." Before she could finish her sentence, something unexpected happened. A small crowd had started to gather, their murmurs growing louder as they watched the interaction unfold. And then, as if karma itself had decided to intervene, the woman took a step back, still gesturing wildly. The woman's heel caught on the edge of the sidewalk as she stepped back, her balance wavering for a split second. Her arms flailed in an attempt to steady herself, but it was too late. With a loud thud, she landed on the ground, her expensive handbag spilling open, scattering its contents across the pavement. Lipsticks, a wallet, and a pair of sunglasses tumbled out in all directions. For a moment, the crowd collectively gasped, and everything seemed to freeze. James sat in his wheelchair, watching the scene unfold. He wasn't one to take pleasure in someone else's misfortune, even if that someone had just been hurling insults at him moments ago. He hesitated, unsure if he should offer to help or stay where he was. The woman's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger as she scrambled to pick up her belongings. She glanced around, noticing the onlookers whispering and smirking. "Why are you all just standing there?" she barked, glaring at the small group of people who had gathered. No one moved. Some averted their eyes, while others quietly walked away, unwilling to get involved. It was clear that her earlier behavior hadn't earned her any sympathy. James leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the wheels of his chair. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked, his tone calm and genuine. She snapped her head toward him, her eyes narrowing. "I don't need your help," she spat, her voice sharp enough to cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "This is your fault anyway, sitting here in the middle of everything. People like you." James raised a hand, signaling her to stop. "Ma'am," he said firmly but kindly, "I'm just trying to be polite. There's no need for all this." Her mouth opened as if she were about to fire back another retort, but something in James's steady gaze made her pause. For a moment, she seemed at a loss for words. She hurriedly stuffed her belongings back into her bag, muttering under her breath. The tension was thick, and the crowd began to disperse, realizing that the drama might be over. James took a deep breath, hoping this would be the end of it, but the woman wasn't done. As she stood up, she dusted herself off and looked around as if searching for someone else to blame. Her eyes landed on a young woman nearby, who had been filming the entire exchange on her phone. "What are you doing?" the woman demanded, marching toward the young woman. "Did you just record me? You have no right." The young woman, probably in her early 20s, didn't back down. She held her phone steady and said, "I have every right. You can't just talk to people like that and expect no one to notice." Her voice was calm but resolute. Delete it. Delete it right now, the older woman shouted, her voice rising in pitch. She reached out as if to grab the phone, but the younger woman stepped back. Don't touch me, the younger woman warned. This is public property, and you were the one causing a scene. If you didn't want people to see how you treat others, maybe you shouldn't have acted that way. James watched silently, his heart heavy. He didn't want this to escalate further, but it was clear that the situation was spiraling out of control. The older woman's face twisted with rage as she turned back to James. You see what you've done? She accused. People like you ruin everything. Always playing the victim, always. Enough, a voice interrupted, cutting through the chaos like a knife. It belonged to an older man who had been sitting on a nearby bench. He stood up slowly, his presence commanding attention. His silver hair and weathered face gave him an air of wisdom, and his voice carried a weight that silenced everyone. Lady, he began, addressing the woman, I've been sitting here for the past 10 minutes, watching you. And let me tell you something. You're the one causing trouble, not him. He pointed toward James. This man has done nothing but mind his own business, and you've decided to turn your bad day into his problem. Why don't you take a good look in the mirror before you go around blaming everyone else for your misery? The woman's face turned an even deeper shade of red. She opened her mouth to argue, but the man raised a hand to stop her. I don't want to hear it. You've embarrassed yourself enough already. Now, why don't you do us all a favor and leave before you make it worse? For the first time, the woman seemed unsure of herself. She looked around, noticing the disapproving stares of those who had lingered to watch the drama unfold. Her bravado crumbled, and she muttered something unintelligible before turning on her heel and storming off, her handbag clutched tightly to her chest. As she disappeared into the crowd, a collective sigh of relief swept through the small group of onlookers. The young woman with the phone approached James, her expression softening. Are you okay? She asked. James nodded, though he still felt the weight of the encounter pressing down on him. I'm fine, he said, offering her a small smile. Thank you for standing up for me. She smiled back. Of course. No one deserves to be treated like that. The older man who had intervened walked over, placing a hand on James's shoulder. You handled that well, son, he said. Better than most people would have. James nodded again, grateful for the support but still shaken by the experience. He glanced around, noticing that the crowd had mostly dispersed, and the street had returned to its usual rhythm. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was far from over. Somewhere deep inside, he knew that karma had only begun to do its work. James sat there for a while after the woman had stormed off, his mind racing. He wanted to shake off the incident and move on with his day, but it lingered in the back of his mind like a shadow. He had faced prejudice before, many times, in fact, but it never got easier. Each encounter left a mark, a reminder of how cruel people could be without even knowing a thing about him. As he adjusted his wheelchair to head home, he noticed the young woman who had recorded the incident lingering nearby. She seemed hesitant, as if debating whether to approach him again. Eventually, she stepped forward. Hey, she began, her voice softer this time. I just wanted to let you know. I uploaded the video. People need to see what happened. It's not okay for someone to treat you like that, and maybe this will hold her accountable. James tilted his head, his expression neutral. You uploaded it already? He asked. She nodded, her face a mix of conviction and nervousness. Yeah, I did. I know not everyone might agree, but sometimes people need to be called out. It's the only way they'll learn. James sighed. He wasn't sure how he felt about it. Part of him appreciated her standing up for him, but another part worried about the ripple effects. Videos like this could go viral, and while it might shed light on a serious issue, it could also invite trouble, for both him and the woman involved. He didn't know her story, and while her behavior was unacceptable, he wasn't sure he wanted her entire life to be upended because of one moment. Look, he said after a pause, I appreciate you looking out for me, but the internet can be messy. I'm not sure if this will help or just make things worse. The young woman frowned but nodded. I get that, she said. But sometimes, the messy part is what sparks change. People need to see how racism and ableism still exist in everyday life. It's not just something from history books, it's right here, right now. James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked out at the park, watching the way the wind rustled the leaves on the trees. He thought about how much had changed over the years, but also how much had stayed the same. He couldn't deny that her intentions were good, even if he wasn't sure about her methods. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, the woman from earlier was fuming. She had retreated to the safety of her apartment, pacing back and forth in frustration. She had no idea that her outburst had been captured on camera and shared online. All she could think about was how disrespectful everyone had been to her, especially that young woman with the phone. In her mind, she was the victim, ignored, ridiculed, and humiliated in front of a crowd. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her out of her thoughts. She picked it up, seeing a flood of notifications, texts from acquaintances, missed calls, and social media alerts. Confused, she opened one of the messages from a coworker that simply read, "Is this you?" and included a link. Her heart sank as she clicked the link, which led her to a viral post. The video of her confrontation with James had already gained thousands of views. The comments were pouring in, some condemning her behavior, others dissecting every detail of the interaction. Her face went pale as she read the captions people had written. "Racist Karen harasses disabled man. When privilege meets prejudice, this is what we still deal with in 2024. She felt her chest tighten, panic setting in. She never considered herself a racist, and now the internet had branded her as one. Why would someone post this? She yelled into the empty room, her voice echoing off the walls. She tried to convince herself that the whole thing was blown out of proportion, but deep down, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, she had been in the wrong. Back in the park, James had finally decided to head home. The young woman had thanked him for his patience and left shortly after their conversation, leaving him to process everything alone. As he rolled down the familiar streets toward his small apartment, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He rarely got messages, so he was surprised to see several missed calls and texts from friends. Curious, he unlocked his phone and opened one of the messages, which contained a link to the same video the young woman had uploaded. His stomach turned as he watched himself on the screen, the woman's hateful words ringing in his ears all over again. The comments below were a whirlwind of emotions, some supportive, others filled with outrage, and a few even blaming him for the confrontation. He closed the video, feeling overwhelmed. This wasn't the kind of attention he wanted. James had always preferred to live quietly, focusing on the little joys in life rather than the chaos of the world. But now, it seemed like he had been thrust into the middle of a storm. Over the next few days, the video continued to spread. News outlets picked it up, and people on social media began sharing their opinions. Some praised James for his composure, calling him a role model for handling the situation with grace. Others criticized the woman, demanding accountability and calling for consequences. But the attention wasn't all positive. James started receiving messages from strangers, some offering support, but others filled with hate. People questioned his character, his intentions, and even his right to be in the park that day. The whole ordeal was exhausting, and James began to wonder if standing his ground had been worth it. As for the woman, her life had taken a sharp turn. Her workplace caught wind of the video, and she was called in for a meeting with Auer. She had spent years building her career, but now everything was at risk. She felt trapped, unsure of how to move forward or how to repair the damage. Despite everything, the incident had sparked important conversations. People from all walks of life began discussing the ways racism and ableism still persisted in society. Some shared their own stories of discrimination, while others reflected on their biases and how they could do better. For James, it was a bittersweet feeling. He didn't ask to be the center of attention, but if his experience could lead to change, maybe it wasn't all in vain. Still, the uncertainty lingered. What would happen next? Would the attention fade, or would it spiral into something even bigger? The tension hung in the air, unresolved, as James tried to navigate this unexpected chapter of his life. James sat in his small apartment, the dim light from his lamp casting long shadows on the walls. He hadn't left much over the past few days, feeling overwhelmed by the attention the video had brought. Each time he opened his phone, a new flood of notifications awaited him, comments, messages, and now even requests from reporters asking for interviews. It was as if his private life had been yanked into the public eye without his consent. He didn't know how to process it all. His phone buzzed again, and for a moment, he debated ignoring it. But something told him to check this time. It was a text from a name he didn't recognize, but the words immediately grabbed his attention. "We need to talk." I think we can fix this. The message ended with a number and the initials LW. James frowned, trying to piece it together. Who was this? And what did they mean by, fix this? He set the phone down, deciding to leave the message unanswered for now. Whoever they were, it could wait. What couldn't wait, however, was the growing anxiety he felt every time he stepped outside. People had started recognizing him. Some would smile and nod, giving him a thumbs up or even stopping to commend him for his strength. Others, though, weren't as friendly. Just the day before, someone had shouted at him from across the street, accusing him of seeking attention and playing the victim. James had stayed silent, wheeling himself away as fast as he could. Meanwhile, across town, the woman from the video, her name now known to everyone as Linda Walters, was living in a state of panic. She had been called into yet another meeting at her workplace, this time with her boss and the company's legal team. They had made it clear that her behavior in the video did not align with the company's values and that her position was under review. The weight of their words hung over her like a cloud, threatening to bring everything crashing down. Linda couldn't stop thinking about how things had spiraled out of control. Yes, she had been upset that day in the park, but she never imagined it would lead to this. The shame was unbearable, but she was also angry, at the young woman who filmed her, at the strangers who judged her, and, irrationally, at James. In her mind, it was easier to blame others than to face the reality of her actions. As she sat in her kitchen that evening, her phone buzzed with another notification. Reluctantly, she picked it up and opened the app. To her surprise, it wasn't another hateful comment or a news article about her. It was a private message from someone who claimed to know James. The message read, "If you want to make things right, there's still time. Call me." Attached was a phone number, and like James, she noticed the initials LW. For a long moment, Linda stared at the screen. She felt a mix of curiosity and dread. What could this person possibly want? She hesitated, her finger hovering over the call button. In the end, she couldn't bring herself to make the call. Instead, she put the phone down and poured herself a glass of wine, trying to drown out the noise in her head. The next day, James received a knock at his door. Startled, he wheeled himself over and peered through the peephole. It was the young woman who had filmed the video. He opened the door cautiously, unsure why she had come. "Hi," she said, giving him a small smile. "I hope I'm not bothering you. I wanted to check in. And, well, I thought you should know that the video has hit over 1 million views." James's heart sank. 1 million views. The thought made his stomach churn. "I don't know if that's a good thing," he said, his voice heavy. "All this attention, it doesn't feel right." She nodded, her expression serious. "I get that. And I've been thinking about it a lot. I didn't mean to make things harder for you. I just thought people needed to see what happened. But if you want me to take it down," James shook his head. "It's out there now. Taking it down won't change anything." He paused, glancing at her. "But what happens next? What good comes from all of this?" The young woman hesitated, as if she didn't have an answer. Before she could respond, James's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. He glanced at the screen and saw the same number that had texted him before, the one with the initials LW. He debated ignoring it, but something told him to answer. "Hello?" he said cautiously. "James," the voice on the other end said, calm and measured. "This is Lawrence Walters, Linda's brother." James froze, caught off guard. He hadn't expected this. "Okay," he said slowly. "What do you want?" "I want to help," Lawrence said. "Linda's in over her head, and frankly, she knows she messed up. But she doesn't know how to fix it. I think the two of you need to talk." James was silent for a moment, unsure how to respond. The last thing he wanted was to face Linda again, but something in Lawrence's tone made him pause. He sounded genuine, almost desperate. "I don't know if that's a good idea," James said finally. "What she did, it's not something you can just fix with a conversation." "I understand that," Lawrence replied. "But she's my sister, and I can't just stand by and do nothing. Please, James, at least think about it." James sighed, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "I'll think about it," he said, though he wasn't sure if he meant it. As the call ended, James felt a knot of tension in his chest. He didn't know if he was ready to face Linda again, but he also knew that the situation couldn't go on like this forever. Something had to give. The question was, what would it be? James couldn't stop replaying the conversation with Lawrence in his mind. It felt strange, almost surreal, that Linda's brother had reached out to him. The idea of sitting down with her, facing her after everything that had happened, sent a ripple of unease through him. But Lawrence's tone stuck with him. It wasn't just the voice of someone trying to smooth over a bad situation. It sounded personal, almost urgent, like there was something more at stake. Still, James wasn't sure he was ready to take that step. The next morning, James woke to find another message from Lawrence. This time, it wasn't a request, it was a link to an article. The headline made James freeze. Asterisk, family of woman in viral video speaks out. There's more to the story. Asterisk. Intrigued and cautious, James clicked on it, skimming the text. The piece didn't defend Linda's actions outright, but it painted a broader picture of her life. It mentioned how she had recently lost her mother, had been under immense stress at work, and was dealing with a personal health scare. James didn't know what to think. Part of him felt a pang of empathy. He knew what it was like to face hardships. But another part of him bristled at the idea of her struggles being used as an excuse. Nothing justified the way she had treated him. Yet, as he read on, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation shifting. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was becoming a tangled web of perspectives and emotions. Meanwhile, Linda was grappling with the fallout of the article. She hadn't wanted her brother to go public with their family's struggles, but he had insisted it was the only way to humanize her. Instead of feeling relief, Linda felt exposed. The world now knew about her pain, her weaknesses, and even her medical condition, things she had barely begun to process herself. The judgment from strangers hadn't stopped, if anything, it had intensified. People were either condemning her more harshly for playing the victim, or defending her actions in a way that made her feel even worse. Lawrence, however, was determined. He reached out to James again, this time with a more direct message. She's willing to meet, but only if you are. I think it's the only way for either of you to move forward. Please, just think about it. James stared at the message for a long time, his thoughts swirling. A part of him wanted to refuse. He didn't owe Linda anything, least of all his time or forgiveness. But another part of him wondered if meeting her might bring him some sense of closure. The tension of the past week had been eating away at him, and he couldn't ignore the small voice in his head that whispered, "Maybe this is bigger than just you and her." Still unsure, James decided to take a walk, or rather, a roll, through the neighborhood to clear his mind. As he moved through the streets, he noticed a group of teenagers gathered near a corner store. They were laughing, their phones out, and James caught snippets of their conversation. "Dude, did you see the new clip? They're saying the guy in the wheelchair might have set the whole thing up," one of them said, holding up his phone. James froze. He wheeled closer, pretending to inspect a nearby vending machine so he could hear more. "Yeah," another teen chimed in. "There's some conspiracy dude online saying it's all staged for clout. He posted screenshots and everything." James's stomach dropped. Staged? Clout? The idea was ridiculous, but the realization hit him hard. The internet wasn't just rallying behind him. It was tearing apart every detail of the situation, twisting it into something unrecognizable. Feeling a surge of frustration, James returned home and opened his laptop. Sure enough, a quick search revealed a flurry of posts and videos accusing him of orchestrating the incident for attention. Some claimed he had provoked Linda, while others alleged that the young woman who filmed the video was in on it. The theories were absurd, but they were gaining traction. James closed the laptop, his hands shaking. The situation had spiraled so far out of control that he didn't even recognize it anymore. What had started as a personal moment of standing his ground had turned into a spectacle, a battleground for people's biases and agendas. He felt powerless, caught in a storm he couldn't escape. That night, James called Lawrence. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "If we're going to meet," he said, "it's not just for her. It's for me too. I need to understand why this happened." Lawrence agreed to arrange the meeting, but as James hung up, a new question lingered in his mind. Was he ready for what he might hear? Elsewhere, Linda sat in her living room, staring at her phone. She had seen the conspiracy theories too, and for a brief moment, they had made her feel vindicated. But that feeling quickly gave way to guilt. Deep down, she knew the truth. James hadn't done anything to deserve what she had said to him that day. Her outburst had come from a place of anger and pain, but it wasn't his fault. The thought of facing him, of admitting her mistakes, terrified her. Yet, as much as she wanted to avoid it, she knew there was no escaping the reckoning that was coming. Both James and Linda spent the next few days preparing for the meeting in their own ways, each grappling with their emotions and doubts. Neither of them could have anticipated what would happen when they finally came face to face, but one thing was certain. The encounter would change everything. The day of the meeting arrived, and James found himself sitting in a quiet cafe, the air thick with anticipation. Lawrence had chosen the location, a neutral space where both parties could feel at ease. James glanced around nervously, unsure of what to expect. The knot in his stomach tightened when he saw Linda walk through the door. She looked different from how she appeared in the video, smaller somehow, her shoulders hunched, her expression cautious. Lawrence trailed behind her, his face a mask of quiet determination. As Linda approached the table, James straightened in his wheelchair, bracing himself. For a moment, the two of them just looked at each other. The weight of everything that had transpired hung heavy in the silence. Finally, Linda spoke, her voice quieter than James expected. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I wasn't sure you would." James nodded, keeping his tone even. "I wasn't sure either, but I figured it was time to get some answers." Linda sat down, her eyes darting to Lawrence for reassurance before settling on James. "I know there's nothing I can say to undo what I did," she began, her voice trembling. "I was wrong, completely wrong, and I've spent every day since that video came out trying to understand how I let myself get to that point." James didn't respond right away. He wanted to believe her, but a part of him couldn't forget the venom in her words that day. "Why did you do it?" he asked finally, his voice steady but firm. "What made you think it was okay to talk to me like that?" Linda took a deep breath, her gaze dropping to the table. "I don't have a good excuse," she admitted. "I was angry at everything in my life falling apart. My mom had just passed, my job was on the line, and I got some medical news that scared me. But none of that excuses what I said to you. I took out my pain on someone who didn't deserve it." James watched her closely, trying to gauge the sincerity in her words. He could see the tears welling up in her eyes, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of something unexpected, pity. He had spent so much time focusing on his own pain that he hadn't considered what might have been driving hers. Before he could respond, Lawrence chimed in. "James, I know my sister messed up in a big way. But she's not the person the internet thinks she is. She's been trying to make things right, donating to organizations, volunteering, even speaking out against discrimination. She's trying to change." James raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "And is that for me, or for her public image?" Linda's head shot up at that, her cheeks flushing. "For both," she admitted. "At first, it was about damage control. I wanted to save what was left of my life. But the more I've learned, the more I've realized how deep my ignorance runs. I've been listening to voices I should have heard a long time ago. And I want to keep learning, even if you never forgive me." The honesty in her voice caught James off guard. He hadn't expected her to admit so much, and it left him unsure of how to proceed. He opened his mouth to respond when the cafe door swung open, and a familiar face walked in, the young woman who had filmed the video. James's eyes widened as she approached the table, her expression serious. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, glancing at James. "But there's something you both need to know." All three of them turned to her, confusion etched on their faces. She hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice low. "I didn't plan to tell anyone this, but I feel like I had to. That video, it wasn't the only thing I filmed that day." James's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her gallery until she found what she was looking for. "After I stopped recording the confrontation, I kept filming from a distance. I wanted to make sure nothing else happened. And, well, there's something you need to see." She placed the phone on the table and hit play. The screen showed Linda walking away from James, visibly upset. But what happened next made everyone freeze. A man approached Linda, someone neither James nor Linda recognized. He spoke to her briefly before handing her a piece of paper and disappearing into the crowd. The camera zoomed in on the paper, and the words written on it were clear. Asterisk. This isn't over. Linda's face went pale. I don't remember this," she stammered. James frowned, his mind racing. "Who was that? And what does it mean?" The young woman shook her head. "I don't know, but I think whoever that was might be behind some of the conspiracy theories about you, James. It's like they wanted to stir the pot, to keep this going." The revelation sent a chill through the group. Suddenly, the situation felt much bigger than a single confrontation in the park. Someone had been manipulating the narrative, fueling the chaos for reasons none of them understood. James looked at Linda, and for the first time, he saw her not as an enemy but as someone caught in the same storm. "Looks like we're both part of a bigger story," he said quietly. Linda nodded, her expression grim. "And we need to figure out who's behind it." The tension in the air shifted, no longer one of conflict but of uneasy alliance. As they sat in the cafe, the wheels of a new chapter began to turn, one filled with questions, uncertainty, and a shared determination to uncover the truth. Neither James nor Linda knew where this path would lead, but one thing was certain. The story wasn't over yet. The day of the meeting arrived, and James found himself sitting in a quiet cafe, the air thick with anticipation. Lawrence had chosen the location, a neutral space where both parties could feel at ease. James glanced around nervously, unsure of what to expect. The knot in his stomach tightened when he saw Linda walk through the door. She looked different from how she appeared in the video, smaller somehow, her shoulders hunched, her expression cautious. Lawrence trailed behind her, his face a mask of quiet determination. As Linda approached the table, James straightened in his wheelchair, bracing himself. For a moment, the two of them just looked at each other. The weight of everything that had transpired hung heavy in the silence. Finally, Linda spoke, her voice quieter than James expected. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I wasn't sure you would." James nodded, keeping his tone even. "I wasn't sure either. But I figured it was time to get some answers." Linda sat down, her eyes darting to Lawrence for reassurance before settling on James. "I know there's nothing I can say to undo what I did," she began, her voice trembling. "I was wrong. Completely wrong. And I've spent every day since that video came out trying to understand how I let myself get to that point." James didn't respond right away. He wanted to believe her, but a part of him couldn't forget the venom in her words that day. "Why did you do it?" he asked finally, his voice steady but firm. "What made you think it was okay to talk to me like that?" Linda took a deep breath, her gaze dropping to the table. "I don't have a good excuse," she admitted. "I was angry at everything in my life falling apart. My mom had just passed, my job was on the line, and I got some medical news that scared me. But none of that excuses what I said to you. I took out my pain on someone who didn't deserve it." James watched her closely, trying to gauge the sincerity in her words. He could see the tears welling up in her eyes, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of something unexpected, pity. He had spent so much time focusing on his own pain that he hadn't considered what might have been driving hers. Before he could respond, Lawrence chimed in. "James, I know my sister messed up in a big way. But she's not the person the internet thinks she is. She's been trying to make things right, donating to organizations, volunteering, even speaking out against discrimination. She's trying to change." James raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "And is that for me, or for her public image?" Linda's head shot up at that, her cheeks flushing. "For both," she admitted. "At first, it was about damage control. I wanted to save what was left of my life. But the more I've learned, the more I've realized how deep my ignorance runs. I've been listening to voices I should have heard a long time ago. And I want to keep learning, even if you never forgive me." The honesty in her voice caught James off guard. He hadn't expected her to admit so much, and it left him unsure of how to proceed. He opened his mouth to respond when the cafe door swung open, and a familiar face walked in, the young woman who had filmed the video. James's eyes widened as she approached the table, her expression serious. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, glancing at James. "But there's something you both need to know." All three of them turned to her, confusion etched on their faces. She hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice low. "I didn't plan to tell anyone this, but I feel like I have to. That video, it wasn't the only thing I filmed that day." James's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her gallery until she found what she was looking for. "After I stopped recording the confrontation, I kept filming from a distance. I wanted to make sure nothing else happened. And, well, there's something you need to see." She placed the phone on the table and hit play. The screen showed Linda walking away from James, visibly upset. But what happened next made everyone freeze. A man approached Linda, someone neither James nor Linda recognized. He spoke to her briefly before handing her a piece of paper and disappearing into the crowd. The camera zoomed in on the paper, and the words written on it were clear. Asterisk. This isn't over. Linda's face went pale. I don't remember this, she stammered. James frowned, his mind racing. Who was that? And what does it mean? The young woman shook her head. I don't know, but I think whoever that was might be behind some of the conspiracy theories about you, James. It's like they wanted to stir the pot, to keep this going. The revelation sent a chill through the group. Suddenly, the situation felt much bigger than a single confrontation in the park. Someone had been manipulating the narrative, fueling the chaos for reasons none of them understood. James looked at Linda, and for the first time, he saw her not as an enemy but as someone caught in the same storm. Looks like we're both part of a bigger story, he said quietly. Linda nodded, her expression grim. And we need to figure out who's behind it. The tension in the air shifted, no longer one of conflict but of uneasy alliance. As they sat in the cafe, the wheels of a new chapter began to turn, one filled with questions, uncertainty, and a shared determination to uncover the truth. Neither James nor Linda knew where this path would lead, but one thing was certain. The story wasn't over yet. James, Linda, and the young woman, whose name they finally learned was Carla, sat in stunned silence, staring at the paused video on Carla's phone. The cryptic message and the man's strange behavior added a whole new layer to an already complicated situation. For a few moments, no one spoke, each lost in their thoughts. Finally, it was James who broke the silence. So, someone's been feeding the chaos, he said slowly, his voice tinged with disbelief. Why? What would anyone gain from doing this? Carla shook her head. I don't know. Maybe they're just a troll, or maybe they wanted to keep the drama alive for their own reasons. I've seen people do some crazy stuff online just for attention or to watch things burn. Linda frowned, her face pale and drawn. But why target us? Why me? I'm not some big public figure. And James? She hesitated, glancing at him. You didn't ask for any of this. James shrugged, his frustration evident. I've stopped trying to figure out why people do what they do online. The moment that video went viral, it stopped being about us and became something else entirely. It became a story people could twist to fit whatever narrative they wanted. Lawrence leaned forward, his expression grim. The question is, what do we do now? Do we just let this go, or do we try to dig deeper? For James, the answer wasn't simple. On one hand, he wanted to move on with his life, to leave the mess behind and find peace again. But on the other, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. Finally, after a long pause, he sighed and looked at Linda. What do you think? He asked, surprising even himself. Linda looked taken aback by the question, but after a moment, she straightened in her seat. I think we need to stop letting this control us. Whether it's some stranger stirring things up or the internet feeding off our pain, we can't keep living in reaction to it. But that doesn't mean we ignore it either. James nodded slowly. Her words, surprisingly, struck a chord with him. For the first time since the incident, he felt a glimmer of understanding between them, a shared desire to take back their narratives and move forward, no matter how messy the path might be. The group decided to report the video and its suspicious content to the authorities. While it wasn't clear if the message or the man would lead to anything substantial, they agreed it was better to take action than to sit back and wonder. Carla also promised to upload the additional footage to her account, providing context for the first time. Maybe it'll help people see the bigger picture, she said, though she admitted she wasn't sure it would change much. As the days turned into weeks, the viral frenzy began to die down. Carla's follow-up video brought some clarity, and while it didn't erase the damage done by the initial wave of attention, it shifted the narrative. People started to see James and Linda as human beings again, not just characters in a viral story. The conspiracy theories lost steam, and the trolls moved on to their next target. For James, the end of the chaos felt like a breath of fresh air. He returned to his routines, his sense of peace slowly creeping back. But something had shifted within him. The experience had left scars, yes, but it had also taught him the power of resilience, of standing firm even when the world feels like it's against you. And as much as he had resisted the idea at first, meeting Linda had helped him let go of some of the anger he'd been carrying. Linda, too, found herself changed by the ordeal. The public scrutiny forced her to confront parts of herself she'd long ignored. She began therapy, not just to process the fallout but to work through the deeper issues that had driven her actions that day in the park. It was painful, but it was also freeing. Slowly, she started to rebuild her life, this time with a focus on being more open, more empathetic, and more accountable for her words and actions. The two of them didn't become friends. That would have been too much to ask, but they did part on a note of mutual respect. When Linda sent James a letter a few months later, thanking him for his patience and acknowledging the impact her actions had on him, James read it with a quiet sense of closure. He didn't respond, but he kept the letter, tucking it away in a drawer as a reminder of how far they'd both come. As for the mysterious man and his cryptic note, the authorities weren't able to trace him. It became one of those unsolved threads, a reminder of the strange, unpredictable nature of life online. James and Linda both chose not to dwell on it. Some questions, they realized, didn't need answers. In the end, the story wasn't just about a heated moment in a park or the fallout that followed. It was about growth, about learning to see beyond the surface and find the humanity in each other. James often thought about the countless strangers who had commented on his life without knowing the full story, and he wondered how many of them had missed the real point. But he also thought about the connections that came out of it, the people who reached out to share their own experiences, the community that rallied around him, and even the unexpected alliance with Linda. Those moments, however small, reminded him that even in the worst situations, there's room for understanding and change. As James rolled through the park one sunny afternoon, he passed by the spot where it had all begun. He paused for a moment, taking in the familiar sights and sounds. It felt different now, lighter somehow. With a small smile, he turned and continued on his way, ready to face whatever came next.